This week's module focuses on the build-up to World War II, especially in the imposition of Nazi laws in Germany, then examines the different experiences of the war to address how those occurrences contributed to the turn to outright genocide by 1942. Note how different examples of eliminationist warfare have existed before World War II, but in this case, civilian populations were targeted distinctly for extermination.
After the death of President Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler took sole control of Germany. He immediately implemented his ideas as law, targeting Jews and isolating them both legally and socially. In 1935, Hitler and the Reichstag passed the Nuremberg Laws, which deprived Jews of German citizenship. Hitler was legally defining a Jew as someone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents. However, many Jews had assimilated into German culture in the 19th century, meaning that Hitler was basing a racial categorization on cultural expressions of religion in one's family. Nevertheless, the Nuremberg Laws stuck, and Jews were identified. Passports, a diplomatic invention after World War I, were marked to identify Jews, since many states had quotas on Jews. The Nuremberg Laws served to isolate Jews from German society by marking them as fundamentally and irrevocably different. The isolation allowed for violence against Jews to become acceptable. Jews were attacked and Jewish shops were vandalized with impunity. This trend culminated in November of 1938 when German citizens, encouraged by the Nazi government, attacked Jewish people and property. It was not the Nazi militia that attacked, but rather the German people, making it a pogrom or a form of popular violence against Jews. There is a long history of pogroms in Western civilization. When Jews attempted to fight back, the government stepped in and arrested Jews for unlawful conduct. The Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, illustrates how quickly Jews were threatened in German society. While German domestic policy was conforming to Hitler's ideals, his foreign policy, beginning in 1938, sought to undermine the Treaty of Versailles and return Germany to a prominent position in European affairs. His first effort was the Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany. Austria was culturally German, and Hitler himself was Austrian, but the 2 German states were forbidden by the treaty to unify. Under the pretext of a communist threat, Hitler sent the Nazi brown shirts, his militia, to Austria to protect the people. After rounding up communists, the Austrian government had a vote on whether or not to unify with Germany, which won overwhelming acceptance in April of 1938. The Allied powers did not stop the unification, and Hitler soon turned his attention to the Sudetenland, an area of former Germany that was now part of Czechoslovakia. Hitler claimed that the Germans there were under threat from the Czechs and prepared to invade Czechoslovakia under the pretense of protecting them. Once Hitler invaded, Czechoslovakia prepared to repel the Germans. Also, the Czechs were allied with the French and Poles as part of what was known as the Little Entente, which meant that France was supposed to come to the aid of the Czechs once invaded. However, instead, the French and British governments met with Hitler and Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, in Munich to negotiate a peaceful settlement. There, France and Britain agreed to the German occupation of western Czechoslovakia. The Czechs, by the way, were not present in Munich, in exchange for a peace accord. This policy, known as appeasement, suggests that Western governments were unaware of Hitler's plans for expansion. More recent research points to how leaders of both Britain and France immediately began preparing for war after Munich, illustrating how they were also trying to buy themselves time. The Soviet Union feared that the Western democracies would not fight against Hitler, who the Soviets saw as their enemy. Therefore, the Germans and Soviets brokered a secret peace agreement in August of 1939 that prevented the 2 powers from going to war with each other for a decade, although Hitler would break the deal after 2 years. As part of the agreement, the 2 powers divided Poland, illustrating that Hitler had already drawn up war plans to march eastward. In September of 1939, the Germans invaded Poland under similar pretenses as before, in order to protect a German minority. However, the British and French this time declared war on Germany and hoped to provide support to the Poles. Yet the Poles faced 2 enemies, as the Soviets invaded from the east and the Germans from the west. Spiegelman's Mouse, which you're reading for this week, gives one the idea of the confusion of this period, which lasted less than 3 months. As the war in Poland wound down, the war between France and Germany failed to materialize. Thus the term phony war, or guerre de trolls, The French had prepared for a similar war as World War I and had constructed a massive series of fortifications, known as the Maginot Line, in preparation. However, the line did not extend all the way to the English Channel because of diplomatic reasons. Thus, the French flank was exposed as it had been in World War I. But the Germans invaded through the center in a bold attack based on new tactics concerning moving artillery, i.e., tanks. Once the German army broke through the French defenses, the political divisions became apparent, as conservatives sought to get the French out of the war. The French government, the Third Republic, had appointed Marshal Pétain as leader before dissolving itself. Pétain's first action was to sign an armistice with Germany to take the French out of the war. Afterward, Pétain ruled over a small part of France while Germany occupied the north. By 1941, the Germans and their allies controlled most of the European continent. As the map here shows, only Great Britain would remain engaged in war against the Nazis until the summer of 1941. How did different European states operate under Nazi rule? Well, the reactions fall into two general categories. The first was the collaboration governments, which helped the Nazis to implement their ideas, including the Holocaust, due to ideological affinities. The second were caretaker governments, in essence, governments that operated in exile but left behind civil servants to manage a skeletal government. This second one forced Nazis to occupy and administer these states. Let's look at two noteworthy examples of collaboration governments. Vichy France was a regime run by Pétain, an authoritarian but not a fascist government that rejected the idea of the French Revolution. Instead, the Vichy state wanted to celebrate traditional French values of work, family, and country. The Vichy government was the legitimate government of France, and it actively worked with the Nazi regime to round up Jews and provided material support for the German war effort. Volunteers from France joined the German army as many believed in the importance of a Nazi victory for the future of Europe. Yet not all French men and women supported the war effort. Although initially resistance in France was minimal, many French remained war-weary from World War I. The war against the Soviet Union in 1941 transformed the resistance movement as communists mobilized against the Vichy government and its Nazi allies. The implementation of forced labor in Germany for French workers, which was an idea developed by the Vichy regime, expanded the resistance movement by creating new fighters known as the Maquis. Eventually, the French resistance began a civil war in France against the Vichy regime, as French fought against French until liberation in 1945. Another collaborationist government was the Norwegian government. However, unlike the French situation, the Norwegians had little affinity for Nazi ideology. Thus, the Nazis installed a leader who did share these values, the Norwegian Vidkun Quisling. His unpopularity among the Norwegians meant that Norway was both a collaborationist government while also having a strong resistance movement that required the Nazis to occupy large parts of the country. The real change in the war happened in the summer of 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The initial successes pushed the Soviets back, and it appeared that Hitler had orchestrated yet another military victory. But these victories created a new issue for the Germans. The Jewish population of Germany had been small, but the areas that it now occupied in the east were traditional Jewish areas, meaning the number of Jews under German control had exponentially expanded. German leaders met at the town of Wannsee to find what they called a final solution to the Jewish question, which they decided there was extermination. The methods for extermination would be tried out in the war with the Soviet Union, which was in essence a race war. Unlike the war in the West, extermination was the order of the day in the East, meaning that the Nazis did not take prisoners. Oftentimes, Soviet citizens were initially happy about the arrival of the Nazis, especially considering how they were treated under Stalin. But that support faded once the Einsatzgruppen and the killing vans arrived. The Soviet victory in 1942 at Stalingrad crippled Hitler's offensive, but by this point, the Holocaust had begun.